Have you ever thought, where will everyone park when a new building is built? What about when an entire block of apartment buildings are built? Multi-story apartment buildings have sprouted up all across America. Massive residential buildings on former parking lots. Northwest Portland, Oregon added over 2,000 units in a 2-year period alone. When this development occurs, where will people park? Why do developers build housing without parking for every unit? And how did cities allow this? If most of us own cars, then where will we park? To find answers to these questions, let's ask people who build them. I'm Dominic, I'm a city planner. If you're interested in cities, economics, and planning, subscribe for more videos. So why were parking mandates required in the first place? After 1950, many cities and towns started requiring a specific number of parking spaces built for every use inside a building. As urban centers declined in population after 1950, a goal was to make driving downtown as fast and easy as possible. So highways and parking lots were seen as an economic driver for cities. Unfortunately, the opposite happened. Productive buildings and interesting places were raised for parking lots. So how do parking requirements impact how architects design and plan buildings?
My name is David Andrade. I've been an architect now for approximately, I've been practicing for like 20 years. The parking discussion is interesting because with a lot of the projects that I've worked on, in the urban areas is where you run into this more, and it's where you don't have a lot of space for parking. Costs associated with building parking garages or subterranean parking, those can be really high. I think it was maybe like a year or two ago where it was roughly around $35,000, and that's an approximate for every single parking space in the garage.
Parking requirements aren't cheap either. As David mentioned, and most studies find, the cost of constructing one single parking space ranges from $5,000 for a surface level spot to $35,000 per space inside a parking garage. Because so much was required historically, parking takes up about 1/3 of the land area in US cities. And there are an estimated 8 parking spaces in the US for every car. You might think these requirements are scientific, but that's not always the case.
Most parking minimums are to account for the busiest shopping day of the year. My name is Hayden Clarkin. I am a transportation engineer and planner. I usually go as the plan engineer. I go by the Transit Guy online. It's my online moniker. And even then, Christmas Eve and Black Friday, which are kind of our biggest days, don't even have full parking lots. And so we've kind of built a country around the maximums of what it could be, but we don't do that in everyday life. We don't do it in other transportation practices. And so it really has kind of created this issue where places like Providence, like downtown Providence, are like 20-something% of the land of Providence is surface parking. And it's a big issue, and it's an issue everywhere. It's not really an issue specific to any one city, unfortunately.
So what happens when a city eliminates this requirement to build parking? In 2017, Buffalo, New York became the first US city to eliminate off-street parking requirements. Instead, they required transportation demand management plans from developers. These plans estimate the potential parking demand, while factoring in public transportation and shared parking arrangements. Buffalo found that new parking for mixed-use developments dropped in half compared to what would have been previously required, while parking for residential, commercial, and civic developments actually exceeded previous minimums. I would think that a study by the developer on each individual basis would be more helpful to estimate the true demand for off-street parking as opposed to the zoning ordinance. Do you ever see mismatches between what you guys have to build versus what you guys think, or do they usually kind of come in around kind of close?
A lot of times common sense comes into play, right? And you look at a building, and if 75% of the building is going to be a studio or a 1-bedroom, there's no need for a 2-to-1 parking ratio. And though it may be prescribed that way, that's where those conversations come into play. And like I said, those meetings with requesting a variance to just say, hey, listen, for my 2 bedrooms, I understand 2-to-1, it makes complete sense. For the 1-bedrooms, I understand maybe a 50% requiring a 2-to-1 and easing up those restrictions.
So what did cities look like before parking requirements? Ironically, the places and neighborhoods people enjoy visiting the most are illegal to build under today's parking requirements. Even Disney's Magic Kingdom markets a mainstream utopia that would be illegal to build under today's parking requirements.
If you take a place like Federal Hill or Greenwich Village or any sort of or north end of Boston. All of these places we know and love have terrible parking options because they're kind of intact historically as they've always been. And if we were to rebuild all of these areas that we know and love, all of these neighborhoods that we know and love, each building and each parcel would have to have their own amount of parking. And so basically, if you were looking at like the North End or Little Italy or whatnot, for the people listening, imagine every other building is gone that you see, and there's a parking lot there instead, because each building has to have a certain amount of parking. The way that you could get around that is this idea of shared parking, and that in a city or a municipal sense or a business improvement district sense or just a neighborly sense, this idea that we holistically look at neighborhoods and say like, okay, based on this, we need this much parking, right? So where does it go? Maybe it's the parking garage down the street. Maybe it is one centralized surface parking lot that serves the neighborhood. We can do that, but right now the way we do it is it's piecemeal.
What's also interesting is the cost of owning a car is over $12,000 a year. That's over $1,000 a month to operate and own a new car. And over the past 4 years, the cost of a used car has increased by 40%. If other transportation options are available to people that are faster and less expensive than driving, would they take it? But just in general, how people actually use the system so they're utilized well?
We don't provide alternatives to the car, right? We just provide it as like to fill in a gap for people who don't have one. And so when you're thinking of like, well, what does providing an alternative to the car look like in a transit sense? You're thinking like, is it fast? Is it frequent? Is it direct? Is it safe? Is it reliable? And so when you start thinking of it that way, where like most people who travel into Manhattan take the train or the bus because it's a nightmare to park and the congestion is bad, you've made an implicit decision to take it. And I think that's kind of how we need to look at it. I don't think everyone needs to be car free and everyone needs to be on transit for all of their trips, but most trips in Rhode Island and most trips in like Los Angeles and whatnot are under 5 miles. And so when you start thinking of like, maybe like a third of your trips are by train or by transit, that cuts down a lot of congestion if everyone's doing that.
I think there are 3 scenarios at play here: dense urban environments, suburbs, and rural areas. In dense urban environments, many people have access to public transportation, taxis, Ubers, walking, and biking infrastructure. New construction in these cities may not need to have the same parking requirements as historically prescribed. In fact, having a massive parking lot would take up valuable land that could be used for places that make a city a city. Second, in the suburbs, most of these cities and towns built all their housing separate from grocery stores, businesses, and places to work. It makes sense that suburbs would require spaces for people to park. The trade-off is the more land that is used for parking, the less land there is to be used for open space, housing, or productive commercial use. So it's important for suburban cities and towns to not over-mandate parking, so they can still generate the property taxes necessary to provide their services. The third case is the rural environment. This is where free market economics of parking comes into play. Almost everyone needs a car if the town is rural, so new construction will probably already include plenty of parking regardless of what's required. So where will people park? In most US cities, the answer is there are still plenty of places to park, because cities historically overbuilt parking. And the irony is, if dense cities continue to build and mandate excessive parking, you'll have a worse traffic and parking problem by inducing demand. By only building what is needed, cities will have more space for parks, housing, and stores. Maybe a better problem for cities to have is to have to find a place to park instead of trying to find a place worth parking for.